All right, this week I decided to change things a little bit because we're many people, lots of you are new. Thank you for joining us. It's really special that we are mixing the group so much, and now we've got people from Valencia, from, ones that joined us on the internet just randomly, and we also have people from the course, so that's great. I really like that mix. And I decided this week, rather than me speaking for half an hour in the beginning about the topic, I think there are people here today that can probably contribute a lot more than me and have a lot more valuable insights than me. Of course, I'm going to, interject every now and then, as always. But why don't we straight away start with the brainstorming on Uranus, Aquarius in the 11th house, and just see where this is going to take us. We can just take turns and add another keyword or another part of the archetype that we can think of at the moment, and just be a bit more, interactive, a bit more sharing. I suggest we start with something which is just one very little part of what we're talking about today, but just as an initial topic. And this is the contrast between Saturn and Uranus. As we talked about Saturn last week, and I think this is going to be a good transition between the two archetypes, which are so opposing and contrasting, but at the same time they have so much in common. And one of my easiest ways to grasp the Aquarian archetype and Uranus is through comparison with Saturn. And let's see what we can think of in this respect. What do you guys think? Anyone can just start. I don't know whether you had a chance to look at the article I posted, the Rudyard article about Saturn and Uranus. We just had Lynn and Gabriela. Hello?
I think of Saturn as the paradigm and Uranus as the paradigm buster.
Very well put. Interesting. Yeah. So, okay, yes, it's this contrast between the structure, the system, the rules and regulations of Saturn, the boundaries, and everything that's prescribed as a particular way, traditional way of doing things. Uranus is this urge of freedom out of that boundary and of independent thinking outside of the box of Saturn. What comes to your mind in terms of contrasts of these two archetypes?
I think for me, Saturn is actually the establishment, and Uranus is both the paradigm and the paradigm buster, if you like. I think it has a dual function. It creates the sort of ideology or template, whatever, by which people can live. Could be political or whatever. But it also seeks to change it at will. So it's that urge to change things as well, as sort of maybe impose an ideology that works for everybody, or that it believes that will work for everybody. That kind of paradigm. That's why it's the way I see the difference. Saturn's more of the establishment.
So the status quo of Saturn.
Yeah, everything that is already up and running and established, that to me is Saturn, and well, of course, Capricorn as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, yeah, we have the system, and we've got this constant energy shift between the desire of tradition and system, as every culture is presumably very conservative and wanting to preserve itself and keep to the norms of whatever and however things have been run so far, the status quo. And the Uranian urge is this desire to not be consistent with that all the time, but to dare go outside of the the limits of a particular way of thinking or a particular way, especially of doing things. And it's a bit of a rebellious streak, isn't it, there, to dare to do this? Yeah. And I think you would probably agree how interestingly the two turn to each other eventually, as whenever we want to extend beyond the boundaries of Saturn, and say rebel against a particular norm in society, forming groups and societies that are somehow opposing the status quo, eventually they turn into a similar system. Uranian groups become, the new status quo of tomorrow eventually, if they're left over time to run their course.
That's true. And Uranus says, let's change what isn't working. Let's move forward. Let's do something new that might work for everybody. And then eventually Saturn has to come in and say, yeah, okay, we're here, but what are the parameters of this? What's the structure of it? How do we make this something that can stay or do good? It needs some kinds of boundaries and understanding. It can't just be random, running around doing anything you feel like at any given moment. So in some ways they do work together. One has to come in and forge an opening, and the other one has to come in and secure that opening for whatever the future is going to bring. And the new future will become the status quo, as you just said.
Yes.
Yeah, and in addition to that, you have to have the structure of Saturn. Saturn is also the boundary, as we know. And so you really can't get to Uranus unless you go through Saturn.
That's such a good point, Marie, of how Aquarius. Now I'm going to slightly switch to another point about Aquarius and Uranus, which is very often misunderstood. And Liz Green talks a lot about this in her book, The Art of Stealing Fire. I don't know if you know that book on Uranus. She's trying to make this distinction between individualism and eccentricity, or being somehow different from the norm. That she's basically trying to explain that Uranus is not necessarily individualistic. Aquarius is opposite Leo in the zodiac, and Leo is the ultimate solar energy of personal individualistic drive, and how very often Aquarius looks like or seems like it's individualistic. Well, actually, it's so dependent on societal structures and ultimately on Saturn. In order to have something to rebel against or to fight against or change, there needs to be something in the first place there to be changed, isn't it? And a particular structure, norm, and collective energy. And it's ultimately a very collective reaction.
I think that is very well embodied in Aquarius in the sign, because for me anyway, the sign does have a dual rulership still. I still recognize Saturn as the co-ruler of Aquarius for sure.
Me too.
And I see it in Aquarians, they're very careful at what they want to change, normally anyway, and what they don't want to change, and they consider things very well. They seem to embody that balance that is needed, I think, definitely.
Yes. Yeah, the way I see it is as some sort of a regulating system of already existing structures, not just in society, but also in ourselves psychologically. Everything that we are too, all over the long term too comfortable with or secure in, the Uranian force is that force that breaks this security and is making things, usually Uranian transits are causing a lot of anxiety because they shatter the structure of what our world is about as a constant. And it's no longer able to remain a constant because in there, either something needs to move into another level, another higher level eventually, or it needs to be removed and reformed in a way, transformed, transfigured, however you want to name it. But something needs to move forward from the stuck situation, which every Capricornian system or Saturnian system eventually gets to a maximum of its potential for expansion and for how much it can integrate in it. As an empire, for example, can only expand to a certain degree, and after that new rules and regulations need to be adopted in order for all those different parts of it to be able to function together. Right?
But it starts to corrupt, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's exactly what I had in mind.
Starts to it, really like it is now, like it has been for a while.
We live in such times at the moment. maybe they can be compared to the fall of the Roman Empire, and it's something similar going on in this at this point. And so many interesting things are happening around Uranian energies at the moment. We've got Saturn in Aquarius. We can talk about that later on. And not only, it's really the beginning of the age of Aquarius. Maybe someone else will say something about this if you guys know more.
I think if we're going to talk Saturn and Uranus, we also have to include Chiron in the picture, because if we're going to consciously transform, we need to be proactive, as was said earlier. So if we look to Chiron, Chiron is the great path of divination, which is so much of what astrology, in my sense, is all about. You know, about exploring the unconscious through the symbolism and expanding our beliefs proactively, rather than waiting for, you know, sudden shocking transformation. We can choose to self-transform. And that's where, you know, the many tools of astrology and metaphysics in general are at our service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very much so. And you think that Chiron can help in the conscious, bridge building between the planets up to Saturn and what comes beyond. I was very interested to discover, maybe you know this, that Uranus is twice as far away out, kind of out from the sun as Saturn. So as much as we've got up to Saturn, this pretty much the same distance that this contains all the inner planets, pretty much the same distance is between Saturn and Uranus. And of course, somewhere in between that is Chiron, but it's really like a demarcation point of how different the outer planets, how much of a different sort of planets they are. You know, Rudyard calls them the ambassadors of the galaxy. Uranus is the first one like that. And it was a Uranian shock when it was discovered in 1781. Nobody expected. And I think in many places you would read that they saw, people were seeing Uranus a long time before that date. But nobody really supposed and dared to think that there may be more than 7 planets in the solar system, as this whole system was so neatly ordered. You know, the 7 days of the week, the 7 planets, this number 7 appearing everywhere in culture and in all sorts of symbology. Probably nobody wanted to shatter that neat system by even thinking and even supposing that there may be one more planet. But yeah, eventually, officially, it was discovered in the Age of the Enlightenment, which is so much to do with the symbols of Uranus, and during the time of 3 major social revolutions, including the French Revolution and the American Revolution, which, if we dig up and explore history, it's abounding examples of how Uranus acts as a force in society, and what happens when it's also eventually exaggerated. This initial brilliant idea of idealistically following a new path, which is presumably, it's really idealistic. That's how it normally turns itself around into an oppressive system that may disregard individual human rights, as Uranus is not a human planet. It's a very distanced archetype, one that has to be often reminded. If you have a lot of it, I guess, people that have a lot of it, I believe, have this a bit of a disconnection, I would say, from earthly, logical, and material existence. And I live with someone that's very Uranian. My partner is very Uranian, and we often joke how it's almost like he lives in his head a lot more than he lives down here on Earth. And I think that's typical for you Aquarians. Is that right? Those of you that are Aquarians, would you confirm it?
Yeah. I'm not Aquarian, but Uranus is a singleton for me. It's the only planet I have above the horizon, and it's the most highly aspected planet I have, and it's also part of a grand square. And, for my whole life, people always said to me, "You're so strange, you're such a rebel, And I never felt that by any means. And now that I've been doing astrology and understand more, I kind of get where they saw this, where I didn't, because that was just me. But thinking about Saturn being the co-ruler of Aquarius, and before Uranus was discovered, we had the 7 planets, and we had a very nice balance. Everything was balanced because other than the sun and the moon, all the other planets had dual rulerships. So everything balanced out very nicely. And then Uranus comes along, and very characteristic of it, it shook things up. It broke the order. It said, yeah, that was a nice balance while you had it, but guess what? It doesn't work anymore because I'm here to shake it up. So I really do think, you're right, because Saturn was the boundary of what everybody knew. And then you have Uranus come in and say, well, we're moving forward in a whole new reality.
Yeah, and it obviously happened exactly in the moment when it was meant to happen. As psychologically, humankind was ready for that planet to embrace its meaning, to embrace its, the psychology of what Uranus is about. It didn't have to be just adjusted to fit the picture. It was naturally coming forward with this progress in technology, progress in communication. This is like probably the beginning of this transition period to the new big era of Aquarius as well. And we were able to maybe now function at least some of the people are able to function at a higher level beyond Saturn and beyond everyday survival and survival of the fittest, or I don't know how to call it, and to extend into another realm, which is what Uranus was about at the time. And we're still learning what it is about, actually. I'm not sure anybody really understands, even now, these 3 planets.
Yeah, I agree with that. But I also like to look at the mythology.
Yes.
Because I believe that the mythology really informs us as to what Saturn and Uranus, what their job actually is.
Mm-hmm.
And in my opinion, because Saturn, Saturn is structure, Uranus, you think about the mythology of it, Uranus comes along and really does change the boundaries and changes the structures, and you really can't change those structures without Uranus. And you think about what was born because of the castration that happened in mythology. We have Venus because of it.
Maybe we should sum up a little bit. Maybe not all of you know the myth. There are actually 2 different myths which are to do with this archetype. And I personally connect everything more with Prometheus and the story about Prometheus. But yes, if we look at the standard, the general myth of Uranus or Uranus, the god of the sky, being castrated by his son Kronos, Saturn. So it's a typical story of overturning of the old rule by the new rule. And Kronos was one of those ugly children, the Titans, of Uranus, which was not a perfect child like every other that they had with Gaia. And that's from here we can pick up the idea of this idealistic image that Uranian energies, Aquarian energies, tend to build in their head about everything. And if something doesn't live up to the standard, it's hardly a human standard. It's like some sort of a perfectionist standard. Then they want to disregard it or hide it, or just, it's not perfect. It's human. It's too earthly for the taste of the god Uranus, which is more of a air kind energy. And we know how air signs are very how can I say, not that well connecting with the earth element. There is a big contrast there. So we have Kronos as the earth element and Uranus as this idealistic air energy. And Kronos comes along, overturns his father, and I think this was the beginning of the golden age, without going into too much details there about the myth. But this castration is also how, in situations in life when there is this rebellious impulse or eccentric idea or something outside of the norm, the Saturnian structures and norms come and kind of put an end to it, or quench the fire somehow, and don't allow it to continue spreading or to continue shattering the system. So this is really the effect of Saturn on Uranus, as it's not a complete overturn. These forces constantly kind of interact within us. And at certain situations, one of them takes more force, while in the next moment we can have the opposite. This Saturn, the fear of losing boundary and losing a solid sense of foundation, while Uranus is not really afraid of that. It's this daring spirit of freedom outside of the limit of fear. And it takes a chance in that respect. And here Prometheus, the myth of Prometheus, I think is more illustrating this concept. You know the book by Richard Tarnas, Prometheus the Awakener? Yeah? I really recommend it if you don't have it. It's a small one. It's actually an essay. It's not really like a big book. But I think it definitely came before Liz Green's book, because she, I didn't know about Richard Turner's book until maybe a few months ago when I found it in London. And I had read Liz Green's book a long time ago, and I know she speaks about Prometheus in hers. And I wasn't sure, does she give him credit? Because he got this, idea to stand up and say, well, it's actually not Uranus, the god Uranus, that fits, the planet that well in mythology, but we need to look at Prometheus to properly understand most of the symbols. But yes, she does give him credit. Right in the beginning of her book, she says, take a look at that, because she also thinks he's got a point. So Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gave it to men. That's the main part. And he, broke the rule of Jupiter, of Zeus, and gave men something which they were not entitled to by that moment. They were just primitive, instinctive beings that had no independent thinking and imagination, and they were not capable of creatively, building their lives and thinking for themselves and developing culture. That's presumably how culture started among people when they got the fire from the gods. And Prometheus gave them the fire. That was considered a major crime by the gods, because how does he dare? Now they're going to probably not worship the gods that much if they have that power. It's the typical example of Uranian knowledge, isn't it, that we've got? This thing that distinguishes from animals and from primitive creatures. And as the Promethean fire. And he obviously then suffered a great deal for what he did. He was bound on a rock high in a mountain, and his liver was being eaten up every night by I think it's a vulture, not really an eagle, but more a vulture. And every night the liver, was healed, and then the vulture came again. It was like some sort of a major ordeal over 30 years, and eventually he was liberated, but he paid the price. So he kind of, it's some sort of a Christ figure, the way I see him. Prometheus is very similar, I think, if you look at it. And so what do you guys think about this myth, and what else can we pick up from it? What symbols do you see?
I actually think it was Chiron who liberated him.
Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So Dwayne's point about Chiron fits in here quite nicely, I think.
Yeah, Chiron is the bridge between Saturn and Uranus.
Mm-hmm.
How with its very strange orbit, sometimes it goes beyond Uranus, sometimes it goes inside the orbit of Saturn. It's very interesting if you follow the cycles of Chiron, of how every now and then, and it's interesting, at the moment when we were born, to check where was Chiron in relation to Uranus and Saturn, and this may give us an idea about which of the two planets, Saturn or Uranus, may be a bit stronger in our case, or which one of the two we may be more attuned to, because Chiron really gives this either connection with the big picture, or with the divine, or with the societal topics, learning how to adjust ourselves or how to get our way through the big picture. It's when it's more Uranian, or sometimes Chiron is really dealing with Saturnian wounds, with something more everyday or family connected, for example, or anything to do with the system or society. And so in the Saturnian case. But yeah, it's a very interesting bridge between the two, and could help in the different years when it changes its position in the sky. We have this opportunity to either involve some Uranian ideas in our Saturnian life, or the other way around. We are able to go out from Saturn, thanks to Chiron. And Chiron is very important. I use Chiron all the time. I don't know whether you do. I mean, equally to all other planets in the charts. And I don't think this is like a minor factor. It's, to me, equally important. But Prometheus means foresight.
Mm-hmm.
So that quality of foresight, the Uranian quality of being able to sense, but it really works like a channel. It's not that the Uranian person really is the originator of that idea, whatever idea, brilliant breakthrough idea it may be. But it seems to work like this, that if you are very Aquarian and you've got a lot of, a very strong Uranus, for example, you become a natural channel for those energies coming from outside Saturn in the system, and you being able to catch them as signals, as almost like radio waves, and be able to then translate them and modify them so that people that don't have that ability can understand and can implement them. So that's the foresight ability of Prometheus as well. Prometheus in mythology has a brother called Epimetheus. And Epimetheus is the opposite. It's hindsight. It's being able to figure out something after the fact. Well, the Promethean mind and the Uranian mind is this one that is being able to see forward into the future. It's very future-oriented. And to sense, it's really always looking forward. That's another big contrast between Saturn and Uranus, how one is always like looking back while the other one is always looking forward. Yeah. And what else in the myth of Prometheus? It's probably this inclination in people to decide to try and overpower nature. That's a big topic of today, isn't it? And it's to do with all the air elements, but mostly Aquarius, and mostly, this scientific part of this archetype, which tries to reasonably, objectively work with knowledge, with information, with ideas. And based on that, somehow it believes that it can overturn the natural law of, and to somehow adjust it or to overpower it. And we all know what are the results. Not always the best, isn't it? So.
It just occurred to me that the planets from the Sun out to Saturn constitute the physical. Those beyond Saturn are of the metaphysical. Mm-hmm. I'd never kind of seen it in that split before, but it just really makes sense. And in using astrology as a divination tool, we're able to pierce the veils and go beyond the limitations of Saturn. And as we know, there's so much more out there.
Mm-hmm. And there is also so much more out there in terms of personal development. That's a topic that Rudyard talks about a lot, is how, especially using those three outer planets, and starting from Uranus, this is something, say a Uranian event may shatter you to your core in a way that you are pushed in a direction to start asking yourselves questions about what in the existing status quo in your life can be changed or should be changed. And this is the first step out into something transformative that is then so connected to the whole process of individuating and finding the key to the whole chart, whatever the chart happens to be. Maybe even if Uranus is not that prominent to start with in the chart, then we all have those Uranian transits, especially Uranus opposite the Sun or square the Sun. This urge to, this constrained ego, which is so unconscious most of the time, the solar ego, when it gets a push from Uranus, it really can discover itself in a new way. And external events help, as during major Uranian transits, those unexpected events happen most of the time, even if we're very proactive and we try to use up the energy. With Uranus, it doesn't seem to work as with Saturn. With Saturn, you can just, looking at the current transit that you have a Saturn transit, you may just get to work, as you said, Stephen Forrest did, and try to, be as mobilized and as effective as you can possibly be. And maybe that would use up most of it. But with Uranus, there needs to be a shock. There needs to be a change. You cannot just stick with what you know and kind of concentrate on it. You need to be able to be prepared to go outside of your comfort zone. And that's why Uranian transits are so uncomfortable, because they're always about challenge of even who we think we are and what we are used to. There is what's going on to me personally in the world right now. Let's say the negative tendencies have so much to do with this resistance to change and this resistance to embracing Iranian, on a personal level. As everyone is kind of trying to cling into their comfort zone and to what they're used to. Well, obviously, the times are telling us it's time for radical change, and we need to somehow adjust to it. But that desire not to adjust and to keep believing in the system, keep believing in authorities and institutions that were, the norm for many years, is so difficult to distance from, because it may mean that everything we believed in was not really what we thought it was. And that's such a difficult thing, isn't it? Even for me. As open as you are, it's not easy. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to make a little comment. I feel like the fear of the unknown, the fear of this Uranus is so instinctual. Like as babies, we're born with this fear of when it's uncertain or insecure, we feel it right away. So I feel like, the fear of this Uranus is bringing up a lot of fear in people right now, and they're not thinking straight because it comes on an instinctual level where you have to be on a certain level of consciousness to separate what you're feeling instinctually and what you're realizing with your consciousness, right? There has to be the separation of the observer versus the feeler. And I think like the Uranus or Aquarian energy like allows us to separate the observer from the feeler, where this is the one who is living all of these instincts and the instinctual fears and feelings, but there's also the observer that observes the soul, right? Who sees what's going on and sort of just allows it to be, right? Just observes it without really, but also knowing that this is not who you are, but this is just, a collection of your unconscious sort of instinctual nature.
Yeah, Daria, this is so well, about a good point about Aquarius, of how it's unemotionality, this distancing that very often it's blamed for not being emotional enough or connecting enough and so on, being cold as an archetype. And that can help a lot in this situation that you're talking about, because it can have this reasonable, objective, maybe I'm not very convinced that every time it works like this, but potentially it's got that ability to see things from a distance. But don't you think that there is a lot of Plutonian energy involved in this crisis? This, instinctual fear, the instincts of survival, of the fear of death, facing your mortality. The most sensitive point, this is actually Pluto. I see Pluto here a lot more. And it's probably a build-up from the previous cycle of conjunction of Saturn and Pluto. It was at the end of Libra, but I think now we are living through the effects of Pluto in Scorpio. And how 30 years after Pluto is in a sign, it really manifests in the world as a real, how can I say, the topic of that Pluto becomes real in the world, in society, about 30 years after the sign was actually
Are you looking at that for the idea that the generation of people born in a particular Pluto sign, but about 30 years later come into basically power?
Exactly, yeah, that
Okay.
too. Like that, our generation, a few of us here are Pluto in Scorpio generation. It's around these ages, these group of. It's a relatively small group, just a decade, not a big group at all, born with Pluto in Scorpio. They now need to be dealing with this in one way or another. And the topic of it is kind of ringing a bell to me, Pluto in Scorpio, as these topics are very Scorpionic and very Plutonian. And we have Saturn conjunct Pluto again. So that's really making it surface in a way. But Pluto is such a distant, like a not individual force, that I don't think that's going to be able to be controlled on a mass level. Everyone will need to deal with that individually. And yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with you. But yeah, and I feel like the Plutonian sort of how people feel about the Plutonian energy like really depends on it's a very cultural sort of idea, because for example in Asia they celebrate death and they're sort of used to always having earthquakes or also having a lot of Plutonian things happen. So when for example they have a death, it's a celebration, they have music and they celebrate and it's a big party, so they're happy when someone dies, right? So I feel like a Plutonian, so a lot of people are exploring that, you're right, but I feel like the fear of the Uranian, of the unknown, it's an instinctual, it's like a basic instinctual sort of fear, that we have it subconsciously within us when we're born as babies, right? Because when things are uncertain, the baby just can't even like properly function, or then a person has a lot of very deep unconscious problems, right? But yeah, the Plutonian problems are coming up as well. And it's interesting how every cultures are dealing differently with this Plutonian sort of fears coming up, right?
Yeah, what you said is this moon against Uranus, how these two things are complete opposites in us. Like the instinct of the moon against, the thinking function of beyond, just biological life, but something more than that. And what else? I just forgot. Sorry. Go ahead. You. I mean, somebody else can add something because I forgot my idea. What was it about? Yes, of course. So this, another thing you reminded me about, the Uranian eccentricity. And, this, when you happen to be one of the very few which are attuned to Uranus and you're not fearing that, and you can kind of act in a different way, let's say you choose to act in a different way, then you become the outcast. You become the one that's ostracized. Very often that's the case with, the misunderstood Uranian that always kind of turns out to be right at the end of the day, but very often it's the promulgator of the new idea that only comes and is asserted many years after, maybe even that person is already dead. And these, geniuses in history, or people that were very, very ahead of their time, and if they recognized the Uranian part of themselves, I think they were able to plant the seeds, as some of you were talking about, the planting of the seeds, like Rudyard did. He really recognized that he's got this Uranian stake in him, and the result is not going to happen within his lifetime. He's not going to be appreciated. He's not going to be, probably widely read or understood and so on. But that's something like a work for the future. And he's got Moon in Aquarius and many other things. It's just an example that comes to my mind. But do you know that Rudra means lightning? And the reason why he chose that name was because of the Uranian connection there. I don't know if you know this. So,
I didn't know that. Very cool.
But I was actually thinking about this idea of being strange, being different, being like against the norm, and it's impossible to explain why. It's impossible to argue and to convince someone that's more. And I have a total respect for anyone that chooses to be, in the present time on the, let's say, on the Saturnian camp. But because that's needed too. Someone needs to, be there as well. But I personally tend to be a lot more Uranian, and have always been. I've got Uranus out of bounds, Moon out of bounds, and probably that has something to do with it. But I guess at the end of the day, we just need to be what we are. I mean, kind of contribute with what we can contribute, and let the big processes, adjust themselves. What do you guys think?
Well, I think we're all here for different reasons, but we're all here to watch the show as well, aren't we?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm here to assist in the transition from one age to the next. I suppose you are as well. But
we're also actors in the show, though.
And yeah, we can't sort of absolve ourselves of responsibility entirely. We have to take part, or we're forced to take part anyway, aren't we? We can't just live in our heads. It's going to affect everybody. So
yeah, it's such an interesting time to be alive, and such an interesting time to exercise this, to try to combine your personality with the big picture. And somehow, like, it's probably the hardest thing in the world, and nobody really knows how to do it. But probably we are one of the very few. Even 50 years ago or 100 years ago, people didn't have that much Uranian choice as we do today. I mean, we better use it somehow, as much as we can. And very interesting things can come out of it. Like,
in that article that you posted by Dane Rudier, it was talking about, and kind of what Dwayne was actually saying about the physical and the metaphysical, about Saturn being that form and Uranus being the metaphysical. And it mentioned actually about dreams, which I thought was interesting because I always thought about that being more Neptunian, but also that can be, you have a dream and it can be a shocking kind of insight. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. I never thought about Uranus having that concept, sort of that same energy that comes through more of a, the dream sense of it. I thought was interesting.
There is an article, maybe a few articles by Rudier about dreams. And there is particularly one, I haven't read it recently, but he's going through different planets connected to dreams, and he talks about how Uranus can be dreams, how Neptune, and how Pluto. And how these are three different kinds of dreams that are giving us different messages. And the Uranian one is obviously something to provoke you to look in a direction you haven't told before, which is very interesting also, as we need something. Ultimately, he says these three planets are the unconscious, so the subconscious. The Jungian idea of the subconscious, which needs to every now and then erupt out of the it cannot be just instigated in real life. And if you are not attuned to it, the dreams are one of the channels where it can come from. That's very interesting also.
Yeah, and you kind of need the Saturn in order to actually, bring it into the conscious and do the work on the dream afterwards. So that's the same, that sort of energy between maybe Uranus and Saturn of the, creating form out of the thing that is kind of far-reaching at first, or that kind of insight.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's also about how everything to do with Uranus is immaterial. It's never bound on logic or on physicality. Like, for example, when you have a Uranian idea, you may believe in it without real evidence. Uranus doesn't want evidence, doesn't seek evidence. It just knows. It's like this feeling of just knowing. While Saturn always wants to go back to, having proof, physical proof that can be sensed with the senses.
Yeah.
But then also in that article, he's talking about those cases when things are being done consistently, all the same way, say in a primitive society, but not only, just anywhere. And everyone is just doing things in a ritualistic manner. Everything is like the same all the time. And every now and then a Uranian personality comes up and proposes something unusual, an unusual action, one that they cannot prove, they cannot justify, but it's like a brilliant idea, a general idea. They're usually, dubbed to be mad or crazy or whatever, not taken seriously most of the time. But when this is tried out and given a chance to be experimented with, very often that's the breakthrough that comes to things like starting agriculture, or being able to devise all those different scientific methods of controlling nature and so on, that are Uranian ideas. Electricity, the discovery of electricity, the discovery of many things, I think, of that sort.
Mm-hmm.
That you need to, basically, he's talking about how you need to go out of the consistent manner to do that.
Mm-hmm.
A good example of that is the invention of Bitcoin, which tracks very closely to the current Saturn-Uranus cycle.
Yeah, and Uranus in Taurus.
What's that?
And the Uranus in Taurus.
And Uranus in Taurus. But if you go back to 1988, which was the Saturn-Uranus conjunction at Galactic Center, we have this idea emerges in the mind of one person, Timothy May, and from him associating with like-mindeds in small groups just like we are, came further development of his idea. And then gradually other characters came on board, and the idea took on greater and greater form. And it peaked at the full moon of the cycle, full moon point of the Saturn-Uranus cycle in 2008, when finally the complete workable idea was published on the internet as a white paper. And so since that time, and that was the generation of the first Bitcoin, it's become a global phenomenon with a huge impact on the traditional Saturnian status quo, and it holds the promise of much bigger transformation. But it really has tracked closely with this Saturn-Uranus cycle. So.
And you also remind me that in 2008, when you say this was published, is when Pluto went to Capricorn. In the same year.
Right.
And,
so
a lot of
the disruptive technology, that's the way it's described. So, and what it will do ultimately is empower the individual. I mean, it's cutting out the banks, taking them out of the picture. Why do we need banks in between us and our wealth, and our transfer of wealth?
But
it can all be done.
The internet becomes the banks, and who controls the internet is the question.
Yeah. There's always the challenge to control versus innovation, and it's ongoing.
Yeah.
It's certainly not a given that it's going to come in and completely transform the economic system. But the blockchain technology that goes with it is becoming more and more pervasive. So we're going to see big changes regardless, coming out of that.
It's a way to bring in the cashless society, I suppose, to get rid of cash, which is what they want to do, I suppose.
Mm-hmm.
The idea of it as well.
Which is also a dubious idea, isn't it?
Well, it takes power away from the people again, and deciding for themselves what currency they would like to use. It takes away that sovereignty, that aspect of sovereignty as well. Like, you should be able to have a choice. Like, you shouldn't ban cash. Like, I don't agree with that. You should have a choice. Or some of us will just go back to bartering, won't we? I mean, I'll be okay. I've got a kitchen garden. A farming is next door. But like, most people won't be. But yeah, I think everything's got its ups and downsides, but yeah, I think that it's going to get used to bring in, the promotion of the blockchain and cryptocurrencies as a way to kind of move away from cash and, people exchanging money on a local level. I think that's what will happen with that. But then you'll get a lot of black markets coming up, which will be interesting.
Yes. This thing of completely going cashless will be very difficult at the beginning, at least, I think, because a lot of it goes behind the scenes. Even in my work, I mean, I'm sure you would agree with that. Cash is a necessary way out every now and then for small things, like you go to buy a car, for example. You don't always want to go to your bank account, do you? Or you for small business, we go to the shop, and what if your card doesn't work? What if somebody blocked your card, or you blocked your card, or something? This imaginary money is somehow not working. Then you have no choice. You're stuck there. But I guess it's inevitable, the way things are going.
Well, I don't think it's inevitable. I think that you can fight back against it. I think that you can make a case for why, people should have choice still. There should be, I think that's possible. But yeah, they're using the pandemic to do away with cash. I mean, you can't go in a shop where I live and use cash. It's card only.
Yes,
because of the fear of being contaminated. So it's been, shoehorned in that way as well. Yeah. Interesting.
Maybe it will not be, accepted for a while, and there'll be some protests and stuff, but eventually it's not just money that gets wireless. It's everything now, isn't it? It's just probably a matter of time. And that's why I say it's probably inevitable. But I agree with you, Paul, very much. I would like to have that option. And
I mean, there will be. I mean, if it comes down to where there isn't any choice but to buy something wireless instead of something wired that has an Ethernet cable, I mean, that's going to be horrible for people's health, isn't it, long term? Well, that's what I believe anyway. That is all. This extra electromagnetic smog is really bad for your health, and so it has to be choice there. I think there will be a groundswell of people who will revolt against that. That's for sure. If it becomes imposed too much, that's what I would hope anyway. Because you have to have choice. You can't take away people's choice. That's wrong. I totally disagree. Just because somebody else believes it's better, Better for who? Better for them.
There will be communities that create their own currency as well. I think that would make it practical.
Yeah, that's exactly. That would be best. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, maybe there is a Uranian belief out there. If this is like just a suggestion, I don't know. But what if the system wants to control you in a Uranian way? Then it comes from a bit of an arrogance of, we know better what's good for everyone, so let's consolidate, let's get everyone under the same wing, so that then whatever policy we decide to implement, we the smart ones, the Uranians, the technocrats, that's another dark side of this energy, isn't it? Of how this can initially they give you the freedom of the internet, the freedom of technology, and you think you've got a choice, but then without even realizing it, you become so dependent on that I guess there are probably a group of people up there that are in control of all the systems that are thinking, we know better, we are the smarter, we're the more involved, we are the more so maybe for some, I mean, my Uranian partner is telling me, we have this argument, he's telling me, it's not really a big argument, but it's just for the sake of example, what if this is for the good of the mass? Because he says, what about mass consumerism and stupidity and people that are, acting as a herd? Why not have a system that can control all that and make them change when they don't want to change voluntarily? But then, how every power is corrupt, I'm telling him. You can't, how can I trust that those in power are actually really smarter and really better and really they're human like everybody else, isn't it? So eventually that's not going to work. So even if there is such an intention, I
mean, until we have a reversal where the checks and balances come in for those people, the influencers and the billionaires, what really is going to change? The checks and balances are in place for us, and we pay our taxes, but not for them. It should all be turned around. That would be a true revolution. The checks and balances come in place for those people that have the most power, that are changing things, because they're just running roughshod at the minute, aren't they? And we're just following because we have to.
Yeah, yeah. What if this is a provocation for society to look and see what these people in power, the status quo people that have been in power for a long time, are really about, and have a chance to react on it? This may be another way to look at it, just another way to look at it. I'm not saying that's the case, but maybe these people are not really the people in power, but they are like their agents that now, they have been given a lot of power. They have been given an opportunity to bring out, let's say, the technology in the years past, and they have abused that power, and now it's time for them to go because they kind of get exposed. But ultimately, I believe those that come in their place will be the same, after some time, if not in the beginning. So it's just human nature, isn't it?
Eventually, yeah, it will happen all over again. Yeah, different face, same story, I suppose. But yeah. But yeah, I think things are going to get darker, I think, because we're on the crest of that wave, aren't we? The transition between two ages. So you've got an intensification of all the, like if you detox anything, then you get a surge of negativity that comes out, and a purging, don't you? That so it's like not an easy time. That increment between the ages, it's just, yeah, we are in difficult times. But I mean, I'm quite hopeful for the future, but I don't know if I'll see it in my lifetime, what I'd like to see. But yeah, I feel hopeful that we are meant to be entering into a golden age, and the darkness that we see now is just the last death throes, I think, of the old age. But that could last for who knows how long that will last. But we can try and push it. We can try and influence it in our own way, to get these bodies out or whatever.
When we look at the cycles of all the planets, isn't it that at any moment there is something transitioning? Not at any single moment, but there are these relatively short periods of stability after something has, the dust has settled after the previous crisis. And then very shortly after that, we've got another one of the outer planets, positioning itself in a way that another thing in society needs to change. Another group of people will suffer. Another group of people will, maybe win something out of it. And it's a constant revolution of, cyclicity. And I don't believe that there is such a, better time, golden age, or not that gold. Yeah, there are hard times, harder than others, like now. But ultimately, there is always hard times, isn't it? It's always something changing out there. It's
true, but we have a lot of major cycles converging. I mean, we have the grand solar minimum. Well, the jury's still out on that, but we have these solar cycles where you've got the sun going into relative hibernation through this grand solar minimum. So that's letting more gamma rays through, and the Schumann resonance is increasing in the Earth. So that's going to wake people up, like from this sort of sleepy state that we've been in as well. So, I mean, we've got a lot of things happening at the same time. And we've got this, these planetary alignments. I mean, people are waking up. I mean, whether it's through them resisting what they see happening around them, or through just their brain sort of attuning to the Earth more, even beyond the sort of electromagnetic smog that we see. I don't know. I think there's a lot more going on, I think, than just a few little sort of minor changes. I think it is a massive. I think that we are going into the age of Aquarius, and it's big. It's gonna be.
It's all culminating now as an outer expression. But don't you think? I think again, Rudyard was talking about this somewhere. How these three planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, give you those consecutive signs of what is coming and what to adjust to, how to change yourself. And it's like Uranus is the awakener that probably from the moment it was already in Taurus, which was just a few years ago, it was giving already signs. It's not that this came to us so unexpectedly. It came unexpectedly to those people that were not, thinking or adjusting themselves and following things, and they really were sticking to something that's they are comfortable in. But Uranus did give a sign. Uranus in Taurus was about a lot of things. If you started downsizing, for example, your possessions, your consumerism. If you started following the trend of Uranus in Taurus in a good, positive way, proactive way, like Dwayne said in the beginning, if you did cooperate with Uranus when it was still not that shocking and that having to take something from you so that you wake up, then these people now find themselves in a position that they're not really in such a big crisis, and they're actually even having a good time or being prepared or being, somehow there is a percentage of the population that's not, that's somehow prepared for that because they started downgrading, I think, from the years before. And this was like listening to the call of Uranus. And then if you, Rudyard is explaining something like that, if you don't listen to Uranus, then Neptune comes and it, something dies, something is taken away from you, something is dissolved and so on. And then if you don't listen to that as well, and if this doesn't crush you or change you, then Pluto comes and it's now inevitable. And it's kind of coming in stages. Do you agree with that? I don't know if you think the same way as me on this. Yeah.
I think that makes sense, yes.